Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge. Today, we welcome back Alicia Juarrero to help us kick off our sixth year at the Complexity Lounge. Alicia is founder and president of VectorAnalytica with a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Miami, where she is also currently a research associate. She is the author of a brand new book called Why Context Matters, or Where Did Anglo-American Philosophy Go Wrong, as well as the book's Dynamics in Action and Context Changes Everything, all available on MIT Press. So Alicia, welcome back to the lounge.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Just one clarification. The last book is Imprint Academic
I
from
knew
the
that, but I
UK.
didn't call it out.
That's okay. That's right. I got to give credit to the nice
Yeah.
folks in the UK who took a flyer on this one. Thank you.
Cool.
Okay. So, Alicia, how are you?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. A lot of
Okay.
people whose faces and names and I know, and it's always feels like coming back home. Thank you.
Okay. So, this is going to be a conversation about the book. And so before we begin, because it's a book about philosophy, I thought we'd try to level set a few terms to make sure that we're all on the same page. So you begin the book by talking about, the sort of generally the analytic continental divide.
Yes.
Can you give us a brief description of analytic philosophy, because that's the part that you're mostly focused on, and the how you perceive the difference between analytic and continental?
Brief. This is
Brief.
hard. It's not the entire book. It's the whole book. What the whole book is about. I would say that analytic philosophy is traceable to what came to be called logical positivism, and that was a group of philosophers and scientists at the turn of the 20th century, so 1900, before the First World War, thereabouts, who got together with the express intention to refashion philosophy as it was warranted by a world that now understood physics and how physics worked. So at the time, it was called logical positivism. It took its cues from Frege's advances in logic, in formal logic, and then, of course, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote Principia. That, if we want to do it very briefly, that tradition of logical positivism lasted at least through the First World War, and then it started. Well, let me backtrack. That tradition was the idea that logic provides you with a picture of reality, so that the logical syntax of a sentence will map reality. And so what was hoped at the time was that sentences and statements that were about metaphysics could be exposed as being nonsensical, because in fact, it seemed as though they were referring to realities out there, but those were all tricks of syntax that were leading people astray. So logic would correct. Formal logic, formal deductive logic would be able to weed out all this metaphysical nonsense that philosophy had gone astray with for such a long time. That was the philosophy in the Anglo-American tradition. Between the wars, a number of American philosophers like Quine and Susan Stebbing and a whole bunch of people went over to Vienna and studied under these folks. And so all of this was very much fermented in Vienna. Cockett, I think that the author says, Vienna turned the world modern, and it didn't just with Art Nouveau and that sort of thing, but it also did so with philosophy and with a new way of looking at the way we thought. after the Second World War, after the and Wittgenstein's first book was very much a part of that tradition, where in the Tractatus he claims that philosophy should be a logical picture of language, and this is the language that explains the world. Kind of like Galileo had said, mathematics is the language of nature. Well, this was logic, was the language of nature, therefore philosophy should take its cue from formal logic. But slowly, there's an anecdote that when Wittgenstein goes back home after the First World War, between the wars, that Ray Monk, one of his colleagues or his gardener in the Tyrol, apparently did a gesture like this and said, all right, so how do you turn that into logic? And so supposedly that changed. Wittgenstein is one of the few philosophers that has two distinct philosophies, and the second one contradicts the first one. So he basically changed his mind and came to the conclusion that no, language represents forms of life, not formal deductive logic, but forms of life. And therefore, the second book that Anscombe compiled, called the Blue Books, or the Tractatus and the Philosophical Investigations, the PI, tries to continue to analyze language, but from the point of view of forms of life rather than symbolic logic. So in a sense, there are two versions of analytic philosophy. There is logical positivism, which is sort of the formal logic. If P, then Q, if Q, then R, if P, then R, that sort of thing. You have to turn sentences into that. And if it doesn't work out deductively, then it's not even false. It's meaningless. It's nonsense. But then Wittgenstein's second book, well, now we had to look at the way forms of life infuse meaning in sentences and in language and so on. Right. Meanwhile, back at the ranch on the continent, I think as a result, one of my speculations was that it has to have been because the wars were not fought on English soil. Well, I mean, we had the Blitz and all that, but there wasn't any ground fighting in the UK, much less in the United States. And so the whole notion of existentialism had started even with Nietzsche and way back when, after the Franco-Prussian War and that sort of thing. So the idea is life absurd? How do you find meaning in life when there is no truth with a capital T, sort of thing? And so you get the surge of existentialism with Nietzsche, with Kierkegaard, with all of these folks, all right? That doesn't seem to percolate into Anglo-American philosophy at all. That then transitions to phenomenology. Well, look, what we have to do is bracket all the preconceptions we have about the connotations of language. Of course, connotations would be forms of life, right? Cultures give you connotations. So let's bracket that to one side and try to analyze just the embodied experience of perception or sensation. Right, so you get Heidegger, you then get Merleau-Ponty, right? Meanwhile, Bergson is saying, oh no, this is embodied, there is an embodied emergent property. After people had heard the logical positivists talking about logic, this business about embodied emergent élan vital, as Bergson called it, sounded way too woo-woo back then. Nobody in Anglo-American, and of course, Bergson had this quarrel with Einstein that really did it. Poor Bergson just never was able to get off the mat after Einstein just wiped the floor with him at one point. So you have these traditions. Then if you want to fast forward the story, then you get structuralism. Then you get deconstruction. Then all of these were happening primarily on the continent. And meanwhile, Oxfordian or Oxbridge, the Oxbridge tradition is going, this isn't philosophy. And I was trained in a secular, process philosophy was developed by Whitehead, who had been a co-author of Russell. But in the United States, there was no university except Catholic schools and the University of Texas for a whole bunch of reasons that taught process philosophy. Process philosophy, come on. That's not philosophy. Think of Emerson and Thoreau, homegrown American philosophers. But I was always taught, and everybody who studied in the last half of the 20th century was taught, oh no, these folks, we know they're essayists. They're not really philosophers, they're essayists. Why? Because they did not systematically adhere to the methodology that had been promoted in Oxford and Cambridge. What else? Pragmatism, full-blown American philosophy, Dewey, Peirce, and so on. Peirce comes up with abduction. Oh, come on, give me a break. Abduction, what is that? That's beyond the pale. That isn't really logic. Logic is deduction. Even inference is questionable. Even induction is questionable, So forget pragmatism, forget phenomenology, forget existentialism, and most of those were adopted in the continent. And so you get this continental analytic divide that I think is still present to this day in the Anglo-American academic world. And so the dismissal of Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault and all of these folks in Anglo-American, you go to any philosophy department, they go, oh, it's just a constant battle. Nobody gets tenure if that's your specialty. If you're interested in that sort of thing, nobody much cares about that. So that's, and it suddenly dawned on me. And that's why I think of this book a bit of as a prequel to the other book. It's that all of these Europeans were focusing on context, on the influence of context on the history of ideas. Whereas the Anglo-American tradition, starting with logical positivism, had been to strip the history of idea, the philosophy, basically, of context, and try. That's why Richard Rorty's book in the 70s is called Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. What does that mean? The mirror of nature meant our minds should be kind of like a scientific experiment, a telescope, it should just mirror what's it, maybe amplify it, or a microscope, find something so on, but it does not leak its own structure into the observed, which is one of the reasons why Kant gets dismissed very quickly by the logical positivists, because that was Kant's whole idea, was that the way we think is structured by these transcendental categories, but that is the sort of the more immediate break that the logical positivists had with what had gone before them, that they wanted nothing to do with this notion of transcendental ideas, which kind of gets mirrored with Freud. Why isn't Freud considered an epistemologist in Anglo-American philosophy? Oh,
because we have this beautiful psychology department that we have to fit into. because Harvard created a psychology department for William James, because William James had varieties of religious experience. Oh, God forbid that should go into a philosophy department. So let's get rid of that one. And when then James branches out into psychology, Harvard said, well, this is all well and good, but let's put this guy into a new department, which is exactly what happened. And so Freud, the idea that the super ego is the culture somehow
becoming embodied in our mind, and therefore having strictures as to what we should and how we should and shouldn't behave and so on. Oh no, that's, again, that's the context, the culture come. No, that's not philosophy.
Yeah.
So the more I thought of it, the more the different pieces kind of fell into place. Oh, look, Freud too. Marx, oh, he's talking about the plight of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And so, oh, no, that's not philosophy. So it's kind of interesting that we're still sort of here.
Yeah, and for those of you that were wondering how we were going to fit a book about philosophy into a conversation about complexity, I think you're seeing the threads we're going to be pulling. You've heard a lot of terms that we use in when we talk about complexity as well, and that was why we found Alicia's book so interesting. But now we have about reached the limit of my philosophical education.
Oh,
and so I mean, so I'm going to ask Dr. Jabe Bloom to join the conversation because he can actually talk to you about philosophy. So, Jabe, you want to jump in here and see what you have to say?
Sure. Hi, Alicia.
Hey, good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you again. I really enjoyed the book. I recommend it to everybody, of course. I think if I were going to recommend what to read of yours first for novice people, this would be a great place to start.
I think that's why it's a prequel. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
It really sets the context of the other work, not to be too clever, but it does kind of like give you the groundwork that allows you to kind of think through some of these things. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
So I was wondering, like, one of the things I was thinking about, like, kind of a reasonably standard narrative about where this divide might have originated from, at least kind of in the Greek tradition, would be this idea, kind of Aristotelian era of the difference between like episteme and techne, or like real knowledge and practical knowledge.
Correct.
And at least back then, I don't think Aristotle necessarily is like completely discounting practical knowledge, like the knowledge of craftsmen and stuff like that.
Absolutely
but differentiating them, right? So he's saying like these things that are involved in real life, in practical, like the table has to be made out of what's available. And so part of the knowledge of building the table is about the materials you have, etc. It can't be kind of a platonic table. It has to be a real actualized thing that you're interacting with. And therefore it can't be this kind of episteme, this knowledge that is abstract outside of the real world, etc. And it seems that like from there we do develop a kind of a preference as philosophers for this abstract outside of the world knowledge. Episteme becomes more valuable in a way.
Absolutely.
And it kind of develops from there. So I was just wondering, like, when we think about that, is it the positivists that pick up on this and start kind of splitting off the technical knowledge, or just to open up another possibility for discussion, is the fact that like we stripped ethics out of technology, out of techne. We like removed those things in a way to try to make techne more like episteme, that now we get in this situation where we have a lot of technologies that seem to be lacking in ethics, lacking the ability to talk about values and etc. And these systems are now, driving a huge amount of the world economy and day-to-day life. So I don't know, threw a couple things out there.
I think you can trace it back before positivism. I think positivism just sort of just exacerbated the whole problem. I think that you get a big, first of all, let me mention Aristotle. Aristotle was big about saying there's a form of reasoning that is necessary for each ontology. So a given ontology has its appropriate manner of reasoning. So trying to understand the cosmos is science that is best understood with deductive reasoning from certain empirical premises. Aristotle was a biologist. He was not. I had always heard the anecdote that Aristotle said something to the effect about, dear to me is Plato, but dearer yet is truth. So which kind of got him out of the running to be Plato's heir apparent to run the academy. It would seem to me that did it for his chances to run the academy after Plato. And where he disagreed was the notion that truth, beauty, goodness, these abstract notions could exist in a realm, a domain, independent of the natural world. Aristotle says no. Aristotle did believe that there was reality, that there was truth, that there was goodness, that there were these absolute notions, but that they only existed embodied in concrete, individuated entities, right? So if you're talking about a table, it has its own, so practice has its own way of thinking. Cosmology has its own way of thinking. But Aristotle highlighted three fields in particular: politics, medicine, and ethics. And he said those are not suitable for episteme. In the Latin version would be theoria, right, of episteme, meaning a deductive form of reasoning, where, you come up with a principle that's universal, eternal, unchanging, absolute, and you simply crank out consequences deductively so that that'll tell you what to do. He says that works for eclipses, but it does not work for politics, medicine, and ethics, because those must be proston chiron, which means as the occasion requires, meaning they are context sensitive, they are context dependent. And so for that, you need praxis, you need phronesis, which is practical wisdom, and so my question that I ask now, and I'm hoping to put another little piece together that's even shorter, that says, so why doesn't anybody think of Aristotle as a relativist or a subjectivist? Given that he did say, look, you just cannot, if a physician said to you, oh, I just went by the book. I mean, that's my 21st century version of putting myself in Aristotle's head. Oh, I just went by the book, you'd be horrified. No, a good physician is the one who would take the general principle, but apply it in these circumstances to this particular patient and so on. The politicians takes concepts of governance a la Plato, but then has to be able to apply it to these particular circumstances in a particular culture with a particular history. So the context is historical, it's temporal. I mean, it's physical, it's cultural, and so on. And that's also true for ethics, and that's why you get in Aristotle the famous golden mean, right? And golden mean doesn't mean the middle, because he says very explicitly the amount of food of an Olympic athlete and wrestler that's right and appropriate to an Olympic athlete is very different from a sedentary scholar. So it's not like you just split it down the middle and the middle is the perfect golden mean. No, it's different to the circumstances, right? And then Aristotle had formal cause and final cause that I won't get into because that'll take us forever, as to how you could explain in biology, for example, how the individual acorn turns into an oak depending on the circumstances. All right. When you get to Galileo and to the 1650s and the scientific revolution, what happens? You get scientists discarding formal and final cause altogether. I am not an Aristotelian. I do not want to bring back formal and final cause. I think there's something like it in complexity, which is what I'd like to talk about. But the Francis Bacon's and the Ockhams and the people who follow Newton, especially after Newton, decide all that exists for causes is transfer of energy from a cause to an effect. That's it. So as a result, how do you explain how does my family imbue me with a certain way of thinking, acting? How does the culture influence how I think, whether it's an organizational culture or Western culture versus the Far East, or how does that happen? Well, it's certainly not the billiard ball notion of causality where a force imparts and transfers energy to its effect, correct? So as a result, people stop thinking of politics and ethics and, well, that gets removed from science and it becomes philosophy, correct? Then by the time you get to David Hume, who was what, 1700s, I think, correct? David Hume has a famous line that says, you cannot derive an ought from an is. Meaning what? You cannot take episteme, you cannot take theoria, you cannot take logical deduction, have a moral, purely factual premise, that is all bunch of premises made up of descriptive facts, is, and crank out, therefore you ought to behave this way. And that, if I would say to this day, is dogma in Anglo-American philosophy. You cannot get an ought from an is, end of story. And what was fascinating to me was that these four women that I talk about in this book, who were at Oxford during the Second World War, when there were no men at Oxford because they were all in the war, correct? They rediscovered from Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein got interested in the notion of thick concepts. What is a thick concept? Consider the term courage. You cannot be courageous unless there is some threat to you. So thick concepts incorporate factual description, this is going to hurt, with a moral evaluation. See, instead of saying you can't, there's the domain of facts, there's the domain of morality, and never the twain shall meet, which is the upshot of Hume's principle. Philippa Foot, the famous woman who invented the trolleyology problem, the trolley that if you make a choice of moving you know what I'm talking about? Should I explain trolleyology or not? No, I think trolleyology is pretty, and she hated it. She thought she disavowed that Gedanken experiment that she had come up with for the rest of her life. But she was the one who brought in this notion of thick concept. She was the one who expanded on it. And so I think attempting to bring in context, look, in this context, the person will be threatened, will be hurt, and their behavior to try to resist that is courageous. That came from Philippa Foot and these women after the Second World War in Oxford, which is what I found interesting. So an attempt to bridge the two. But again, when I think of my education in the last part of the 20th century, Philippa Foot, Gertrude Anscombe always had some kind of a status because she was kind of Wittgenstein's literary executor. She was kind of his literary executor. But Midgley, nobody paid much attention to Midgley. She got lucky enough that she lived long enough to be able to bring biology into philosophy and therefore bring context into philosophy and talk about how the kind of reasoning we do ethically is more like adjusting to the context and adjusting to circumstances, which is more like practice. It's more like what Aristotle would have thought a physician ought to do, or an ethicist. That's why for Aristotle, ethics cannot be taught. See, we love this thinking so much that even the Ten Commandments is almost right. Here are the rules. Is this one case where you violate the rules? Therefore, do not do it. Do not do it. Doesn't matter what the circumstances. So there's no nuanced context that would allow you to modify, adapt, adjust your behavior to follow that principle, but modified a bit given these circumstances. And yet in recent years, that is considered the slippery slope to relativism, to subjectivism, to individualism, to all the negatives that the far, and of course now the far right has taken over that notion of absolute values as being what we have to go back to, because if you don't have absolute eternal values, then you're on automatically the slippery slope towards relativism. But that would have been a surprise to Aristotle, I think. He would have been very surprised to have been told that that's what happens. Anyway.
Yeah, and so like to bring in another kind of author that you talk about a little bit, somebody who I really enjoy, to maybe point out some of the problems with trying to make these arguments. I maybe point out Latour. So Latour has constantly had to kind of have this entrenched battle about being called a relativist, because Latour's philosophy, basically for everybody really quickly, is that knowledge, facts, they can't stand alone. There has to be an institution that produces the context in which the fact can be observed, right? So the really simple version of this is, if you're using a telescope to see a star and make a factual statement about the star, part of that knowledge is the production of the telescope itself. Like, you can't see that thing without having this object in the system that you're in. So there's an entire cultural production system, etc., that produces the ability to see a star that allows you to make the factual statements. Another version of Latour would be, it's one thing to discover pasteurization, it's another thing to pasteurize France. Like, convincing everyone in France to pasteurize things is a cultural problem about how to reproduce the knowledge over and over and over again. And that is what allows you to pasteurize something. So roughly, the thing that that Latour is trying to do is trying to point out, like, facts don't exist by themselves. It's not that they're not factual. It's not that they're not true in the way a fact is true. It's just that they are, in fact, cultural productions. They like actually are created. And immediately by saying a fact has all of this stuff that's stuck to it, and you don't really understand the fact unless you understand all the stuff that's stuck to it, he immediately gets called a relativist. He immediately gets, basically, could be argued one of the most important philosophers of the last 50 years, but lots of philosophers would be like, he's an anthropologist. He ain't even a philosopher at all. So, I mean, I just think how is it that we should think about like this, the difficulty of trying to talk about context as again, being rejected a lot in the academy, I guess.
I think the only way you tackle it is by trying to change the way we understand causes. And that's been my bugaboo for so long that I decided, look, I'm just going to give up on the word cause, leave that to the mechanists. And so that's why I got into the notion of constraint, and especially enabling constraint. I mean, in a sense, the microscope is an enabling constraint that enables this fact to become revealed, because science is epistemology in a sense, because it's what we know to be so. Ontology is what exists out there. And hopefully we have come to the point where we realize that dogs have capacities to hear sounds that we don't, and that's because they have an enabling constraint in the way their hearing system is set up. But that doesn't mean, the problem, I think, was saying it's a cultural construct. I think that doesn't do the proponents of that view much service, because we don't say that about the dog culturally constructs the sound of the whistle. I don't think we say, but if we understood that, look, some facts some reality out there can be revealed or hidden depending on the constraints we humans are using to observe the phenomenon. Correct? I think, but then we have to be able to account for how that interface between our perception, our sense state, our minds, and the world works. And that's where the problems have been. And I always think that you guys do very important work, because what you are doing oftentimes in organizational management, that sort of thing, is you're looking at the interface between the organization and the world around it that it is trying to either service or help or so on. And so we don't understand how those interfaces work. What we know how a dog's hearing and as opposed to a human, but we don't understand it between individuals and the culture around it, because we're not that knowledgeable either about a cell membrane and its milieu, or it's the fluid in which, the tissue in which it exists. We're not sure exactly how it is that the tissue constrains the behavioral options of the cell so that it supports the workings of the tissue. And we do not understand how the cell perceives the changes in the tissue so that it can react. And so I think those changes are radical changes. And that's why when Barbara and I were talking about, my initial comment to Barbara was, you sure you want to do this? I mean, this book is only history of philosophy. Who of your people? Oh no, no, Barbara, come on, give me a break. Really, who cares about this stuff? She's what often happens is that people keep saying, well, we apply a new technique, but it doesn't work. And my answer is, because I think what we're kind of hitting up against now is that the old framework of seeing things from a positivist Newtonian mechanics point of view, oftentimes the new techniques are kind of like, what do they say? Figuring out the fifth decimal point of the existing framework. And that's not going to work. If the fourth decimal point didn't work, the fifth decimal point ain't going to work either. So what we need is an entirely new framework that is able to understand the possibility landscape in which a thing embedded in its environment, in its context, not dropped into a container that is featureless the way Newton tends to think. The environment is like a featureless container. Therefore, all we have to do is make sure we don't mess with that problem by providing a clear, transparent mirror of nature, and therefore we'll get it right. No, that if a thing is embedded in a context, which living things typically are, social systems typically are, political organizations are, the medicine, politics, ethics, aspects, as well as plain old biology, right? We have to be able to reconceptualize causes and effects radically differently. And hopefully what will happen will be that the old way of looking at causes and effects as energy transfer will end up being just one of the limits of the broader notion of what causes and effect are like. And so, first of all, I think getting comfortable with probabilistic causes, analog controls, distributed controls, none of which exists in Newtonian physics as such. They always attempt to reduce it to one aspect of that control mechanism, and that's the one that really is in charge, kind of thing. And that's what I'm hoping Barbara was being very nice about saying to me, is that, well, that maybe complexity theory is an attempt to rethink these kinds of what philosophers call mereology, which is parts to wholes, wholes to parts. But it's also past to present, because if you think of a biological lineage, even though we might be members of our culture, we are also primates. We are also Homo sapiens, but we have some Denisovan in us, and we've got some Neanderthal in us. So to what extent all of that is playing, and how does that cause? We think we've understood something when we can explain a cause and an effect. But we've always tried to shoehorn it into an efficient Newtonian forceful cause in the last 150 years. Whereas to me, I think there's a broader understanding, and hopefully the Newtonian causes become just the limit of this broader understanding. So hopefully that's how we start tackling it. But as Kuhn used to say, these paradigm shifts, it's like one funeral at a time. You just have to wait till the old folks who think of it the other way sort of die off. Sorry about this light, folks. I was telling Barbara, I knew it was going to happen. Come about 1 o'clock, this light streams in, and there's not much I can do.
So I think the other thing that when I think about your work a lot, that might be interesting for people who think about organizations, etc., this group of people to hear about. So like is the idea of hierarchy without the negative,
Right.
Like you often point out there's a negative hearing of cause, right? You hear cause and you automatically think like somebody's going to prevent me from doing a constraint. Is a way of preventing me as opposed to
And
allowing me to do
hierarchy
that.
is the same problem.
Hierarchy has the same kind of
Same problem.
to it, right?
Correct.
And so like just to kind of set up the way I think I understand it a little bit. So like if we talk to a neurologist or someone who's interested in MRIs, they have this almost like a flat ontology. What exists is neurons.
Correct.
So there can't be a mind above the neurons because the
Correct.
only thing that exists is kind of the neurons. That's what they're studying, that's what they understand. And so there's this missing piece, which is the idea that there could be a higher level construct thing that exists that is the organizations of many neurons that actually has a downward force on those same neurons, right?
Correct.
That your mind can change your neurons, right? That there's something like that happens. So, which seems strange to me because I think like learning is basically, a process by which one realigns their neural connections, right? That's kind of what's happening to some extent. But then, you get in these secondary questions that happen here, which are about like, I don't want to go too deep into it, but like free willish things, right? Like,
Correct. Absolutely.
there something that can exist from a higher level and cause downward force to make me change my body, my mind, the world around me, so that I have at least some amount of agency in the world, as opposed to what seems to be argued by materials who are atomistic, that the properties cannot, there is no middle areas, there's no middle objects, there's no hierarchy of things. There's like this flat thing that causes things, but no downward force. Yeah.
Certainly no downward force, but slowly, all of a sudden now, I can't remember, but they're like 100 different types of neurons. Very interesting. And then you start looking at the spikes of the neurons are on and off, so they're digital. But networks of these neurons form waves that may have control properties in virtue of their waveforms and the amplitude of those waveforms, the frequency of those waveforms. So perhaps individual neurons spiking have no meaning, but perhaps meaning can be encoded in the waveform, the analog waveform of neural processes. There's also increasing talk about the glial cells. The glial cells are those that wrap around the axon of each neuron, but they're different. They are not neurons. They're the white matter.
Mm.
And the question of what role they might play, and you see what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to tease out meaning as an emergent property of the complex dynamics of a brain in a culture, in an organism, correct? So you have, if complexity is right, you always have at least 3 levels of organization. Let's say the neural waveform, the neural spike below it, because each waveform is composed of temporally arranged and organized spiking, correct? And then you've got the organism in which it is embedded, and the organism is in turn embedded in a society, a culture, a family, a learning tradition, a métier, a job, a career, that sort of thing. So what in one of the earlier books, I because I think this makes sense, I speculate that a feasible way you can start thinking of free will today is, what do you mean by top down? I would mean that the meaning encoded in the waveform is responsible for the constraint of the motor neurons, and then the muscles and so on. So free will in the sense that it was not caused is ridiculous. In any case, who wants that kind of free will? That's kind of like equating free will with the toss of a coin. Flip a coin, you choose this side, it's free because it wasn't caused by anything. Oh, come on. Nobody, as Daniel Dennett, he who died, once said, it's not the kind of free will worth wanting.
Yep.
That kind of no cause at all is no kind of free will worth wanting. Kind of free will worth wanting Dennett talked about is precisely that. The possibility that top-down causation would encode meaning such that the behavior is enacting the meaning that your highest level cognitive function is aiming towards. That would be the ideal way of thinking of free will, it would seem to me. But that requires you to think in terms of control theory that is analog and that encodes meaning and symbolism. But I think, maybe I'm being optimistic, but every so often I think, oh, look, I mean, this is where seems to be going. That you are
like, I mean, one of the things, again, because I'm into design and material things and things like that, right? Like, part of this is like, if I even have it's like a ratchet problem, right? If I have even the tiniest bit of free will that I can make a decision, if I use that decision to change the context that I'm in some sort of persistent materialized way, maybe I change it from I don't have a pencil or a chair to write things to I do have a pencil and a chair and now I can write things. That changes the trajectory of what's possible for me to think about or do in the future. So you get this like ratcheting effect where like free will might be partially about not me changing just the neural structures in my brain, but changing the physical architecture, material conditions around me in a way that enables me to achieve the meaning or values or virtues that I want to achieve.
And that's what we mean when we say, oh, these problems in society are structural.
Yep.
That until that setting of the context in which we exist, it's changed. So top-down is regulatory. See, I'm really interested in the fact that in biology, and when I speak to some of you guys who are friends, I say, I think in institutions, there's probably something comparable about the structure, the function, and then the regulation, right? Because the function, for example, if I think of PTSD or chronic depression, the system is working, the function is working fine. It is warning the person that there's a problem. The problem seems to be at the regulatory level, where the input from the environment isn't allowing us to reset the setting, the control, like the setting on your thermostat, correct?
Yep.
So I think that's the way we have to think of that, of, well, and then what sets the settings, correct? And what enables the settings to be changeable. And as I was writing, Context Changes Everything, the one before, it seems that developmental biologists who look at how genes develop into phenotypes and so on, they seem to be moving towards the view that what nature selects for evolutionarily are constraints that are robust, flexible, and that lead to other possibilities, that don't shut off alternative. And by the way, why is it that the logical positives, 1902, 1905, 1910, why did they go whole hog on Newton and the physics? Well, obviously because their predictions were spectacular, but why did they totally ignore Darwin? Who was 1850 after all, thereabouts, 59 is origin, right? Something like that. And the answer, I think, is twofold. First of all, Darwin had no notion of genes or even Mendelian likelihood of genetics. Poor Mendel had written a while before about his peas, and the so on. But apparently that had not been translated in English. Darwin had no notion of Mendelian genetics, to the best of my knowledge, one. And obviously he had no knowledge of the DNA helix and the 4 base pairs and so the rest of it. But once that got figured out, note what happened in the 1950s. Instead of saying, oh, goodness, that's great, biology will give us a new metaphor. We don't have to be stuck with, don't laugh, this is the standard joke that everybody has used for 150 years, and that is every discipline, from physics, from psychology, everybody has had physics envy, right? Oh, thank goodness now biology can play. But no, what was the reaction? Oh, good. Now with the Human Genome Project, we will be able, once we decode the genome and figure out how they interact, we'll be able to crank out every phenotype in the world, right? We'll be able to predict precisely what each phenotype will look like. We'll be able to predict precisely every disease, and we'll know which phenotype is getting this disease. Those of us interested in complexity in the early 70s and 80s were going, yeah, right. Good luck with that. But of course, we kept our mouths shut because that was the dominant paradigm. This is the way it's going to work out, because the universe is Newtonian. As soon as we find the laws of inheritance, we will be able to crank out these predictions just as we can, as precise as we can with eclipses. Darwin himself, I was lucky enough to meet Isabel Stengers once, and one of the interesting things she said about Darwin was, Darwin never thought of himself as a scientist. Darwin had, and you guys who are interested in narratives, Isabel Stenger says, nothing reads more like a narrative than Darwin. And she said that wasn't why he didn't consider himself a scientist. The reason he felt he had no choice but to resort to narrative was because of the role mutations played in his theory. There's no such thing as mutations in Newton. Newton is a deterministic linear system where, given the universal laws, the initial conditions, there is nothing that will prevent the outcome from coming to be. Except Newton himself knew that wasn't true because of the 3-body problem.
Right.
Newton had been chastised badly for, in Principia, not having provided a general solution to gravity. And he knew he hadn't done that in Principia. And his defense was kind of a curt hypothesis non fingo, meaning I do not play around with that. I do not feign hypotheses. Meaning what? My science says I need a universal law of nature, a la my 3 laws of motion. I cannot get a 4th law that gives me gravity, but I'm not going to go around feigning hypotheses to pretend I can. It wasn't until complexity theory figured out that as soon as you've got three bodies interacting, you get what? Chaos. What do they say? 3 bodies may equal chaos, right? So you get chaos automatically, correct? And so a chaotic system, I mean, the equations are, what is it? 2nd order nonlinear differential equations. They are analytically intractable, end of story. So to me, the 3-body problem, and that kind of is the equivalent of almost Turing and Gödel's incompleteness theorem in metaphysics. But we kept pretending, no, that's okay. And so we kept, and oh, wow, you know, the main problem now is quantum entanglement. Let's see how we can figure quantum entanglement out so that it will fit the Newtonian paradigm. Wait a minute. It's not helping you out any, it seems, in the last 100 and some odd years. Maybe it too requires some radical uprooting, radical as from root. So to me, it was very interesting that these positivists never paid much attention to Darwin. And please correct me if I'm wrong. My excuse that I don't know phenomenology and all of these much is because I grew up in an Anglo-American university, so I was never taught phenomenology. It was systematically dismissed. But to the best of my knowledge, you don't get Darwin being cited and referred to in any of these continents. So that, in a sense, gave the Anglo-Americans even more justification for saying, oh, you know, this European continental emphasis on context is essayism. It's not real philosophy.
So again, I think Stiegler would be the place that you would start seeing an attempt to reintegrate Darwinian stuff. And who else? There's another.
I think Latour expands it. Yeah, expands it from the medical laboratory, right? That Latour was interested in. To his revamping of the whole Gaia hypothesis tries to naturalize it a lot better. And I think the reason why the Gaia hypothesis just was absolutely ignored for the sake was because the Gaia hypothesis started sounding a bit like Bergson's Elan Vital, you know, oh, this goddess is what controls all of this biosphere. I mean, come on, give me a break. And I think the same thing is happening now with, I am kind of so surprised that philosophers of mind, the number of philosophers of mind into panpsychism is kind of crazy. It's people like Chalmers, and I mean, very respect. And I think the reason is precisely what you were saying, Jabe. As soon as you realize there's top-down influence, the only way to handle it in their minds, because they're still following this is the 5th decimal point of the old paradigm, is either build in mind from the get-go, so even an electron has a mind, or you have this Gaia hypothesis. The homunculus was popular about 20 years ago, right? Oh, because inside the mind, there's a little homunculus that really controls everything. Why? Because they couldn't conceive of a distributed control system, correct? Much less a distributed control system that is doubly distributed, because then it is only part of a society in a culture. correct? So they could not, so as soon as you do that, oh, there must be a homunculus. So there, people were looking for the grandmother neuron,
Yep.
right? Which ran stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's like, again, it's like one of my versions of where this all goes wrong, and kind of go back where we were before, is Galileo basically turns the planet Earth into just another asteroid. He decontextualizes Earth
Yeah.
into just another planet among many, many stars. And he removes the ability for us, well, not the ability. He moves the motivation for us to think of human scale time and human scale things, right? And so one of the things that I think Latour is doing when he's invoking Gaia theory and later in his later works, the thin membrane that we live in on the edge of this thing, is he's trying to bring us back down and say it isn't if we try to imagine ourselves living in the cosmos and rationalize from the cosmos, there's no point. Humans don't matter at the cosmos level. They don't. They're like blips, and you get all sorts of pop culture references to this, all sorts of philosophy.
Oh, that's unbelievable!
Right? It's all over the place. So what he's trying to do is say, if we want to actually care about what's happening to the ecosystem that we're in, we need to recognize that it is. And this is part of what I was kind of pointing out with the hierarchy stuff. It's this middle-sized object. It's not the biggest. It's not like this, again, attempting to get the Archimedes point, the 0 point, get outside of it.
Correct. The lever that will
saying, this is a thing that exists, and we have to study it itself for itself in its at its own level. And you won't find more meaning by going up, 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 and trying to get outside of it. You won't get meaning up there.
Correct.
So anyway, like I think part of what I'm interested in there is this, like one of the weird things that happens, and you talk about this a little bit in the book too, is kind of like temporality and rhythm and synchronization and stuff like that. It's interesting to me that there are multiple temporalities aligned with the scientific studies, right? So like biology has a temporality to it.
Correct.
That is longer than the study of, atoms, which are quite short and small, which is significantly different than studying the cosmos, right? So there's actually like attunements to the different levels of the scientific studies that have to do with scale and temporality and time and rhythm, right? And so like you cannot observe atoms the same way you observe a cat. They're just like they're at different time scales. They don't exist in the same time scale. And so like one of the challenges I think that ends up happening when we talk about these hierarchies and trying to say that they're definitely stuck together, but we can't seem to skip across them very well. So we can't get from biology to cosmos easily. Like they're completely different ontological and epistemological structures involved in thinking about those things. And so when you skip from one to the other, things get very confused very quickly. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I definitely think that's correct. And I think that even within biology, you have a whole bunch of temporalities, because the temporality of an ecosystem is very different from the temporality of one plant or one fish in that ecosystem. So the ability to think not in terms of universal laws, but in terms of contextually dependent regularities, that is, everybody's looking for, when people say everybody's looking for a magic bullet, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the one formula that will give you, that you can apply anywhere, anytime, about anything, that will crank out the prediction that will get you where you want to go. But if in fact, Prigogine had a lovely phrase that every time I saw him in person, he'd say that phrase: nature is too rich to be described in one language, meaning there are so many layers of temporalities all occurring at the same time, that it's very difficult to choose one. But if you are aware that what you're doing is local, temporal, temporary, not only temporal, historical, but temporary, and so you might be able to come up with sufficiently useful regularities and guidance as to where that level, that layer might go next.
Mm.
Maybe not 2 years in advance, but
Yep.
close enough that it will give you, if you're a manager, if you're a leader, if you are a scientist, some sense of, well, I can help manage the terrain in such a way that maybe I can change the bias a bit. To, it's kind of like you're bulldozing or landscaping the terrain to say, all right, look, the historical baggage I'm bringing with me, the cultural conditions I have to navigate in, give me this landscape that have a valley here. It's got a horrible steep cliff here. And obviously I'm thinking in terms of strange attractors, correct?
Yep. Yep.
That the way that maybe I can affect this system is by lowering this cliff a little bit to make the catalysts have an easier way to go over that hump to the next attractor, which looks like it might be more promising, more useful. Or, gee, I'm in a pretty good spot. Maybe I can stabilize the system by providing the contextual shelf of the ratchet. What is the word? You know, each ratchet kind of stabilizes one system, one stage, correct? Before you can do the next ratchet up. So maybe I can provide, and it seems as though maybe the brain does something like that, because there are dedicated aspects in the brain, like Broca's area, Wernicke's area, that are dedicated or to language. Maybe that is sort of the structural version of the ratchets resting in a place of achievement, and the early constraints are usually the more stringent. You know, it's very interesting. Most of the body plans of organisms at the beginning are radial. And then you get to the octopus and the starfish and so on. And they seem to be dead ends. Boy, those octopi are brilliant, but they're dead ends. And where did the dead end come from? The dead end comes from the fact that it's awfully hard to coordinate those 8 arms. So the problem is in the regulation. Those 8 arms do what? I mean, they have like mini brains on each end. So they're able to sense in much more detail and process, but it's the coordination of what this arm is sensing versus the one in the back is sensing. And so the need to come up with a radically different body plan. Notice we're not talking the 5th generation of another radial system, but then all of a sudden it transitioned to a bilateral symmetry. So then you have 2 eyes and 2 nostrils and 2 arms, only 1 mouth, but and only 1 anus, but 2. So why? Because that seemed to be more stable. It enabled the throughput to be better. And then encephalization, meaning what the octopus doesn't have, that it's all coordinated more or less centrally. And then we were able to get distributed control within that brain. So apparently in gestation, the constraints that ensure the body plan, the Bow plan of bilateral symmetry in the fetus, those are stringent constraints. If those are not satisfied, there will most likely be a miscarriage, because you need really strict constraints early on. But what seems to have happened in the phylogenesis from bilateral symmetry to primates is that then as the gestation continues, you get increasingly flexible and context sensitive activations of genes. So that what ends up being selected for is this downstream resilience and generativity. And it's interesting to me that the terminology being used for AI is generative AI, because it's exactly that, right? It's how do you ensure that the ratchet stays stable, meaning, all right, I want to make sure that this fetus is bilateral and correctly so that I can then tack on novelty or differences or nuances or more recent advances that the Homo sapiens has, that the Homo erectus doesn't, that the Lucy doesn't, or whatever. I don't know. I can't get these things straight. So it's really interesting that way. But you have to think in terms of constraints. You can't think in terms of forces, because it doesn't work that way. I mean, forces are absolutely important. I'm not saying you can forget forces. No, but it's a lot more than forces is what I mean to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so like, one of the ways that I think of this ratcheting thing, again, with it, so I want to like invoke the closure idea a little bit, right? Like that part of what happens when the ratchet occurs is the top-down functions to stabilize the ratchet itself. And
Correct.
like one of the ways to say this,
Correct.
right, is like is in the primordial ooze, you don't have certain molecules, but you have the sun, and the sun basically changes the distribution of molecule types so that all of a sudden it's more likely certain other molecules will stick together. And eventually that happens enough times that it starts producing oxygen as the output of these molecules being
Stop for a minute. Stop for a minute. In between the stickiness and the you get, or they don't just stick together randomly, but they start getting organized within that stickiness. You start the emergence of organization.
That's right. But each little organization is a ratchet.
Absolutely.
That it exists changes the probability that more molecules like this will exist.
Correct.
Right? And so the ratchet is partially that, not just that it happened once, not that you went up the energy slope, not that you went, against entropy, not that you did that, but that it stabilized on a shelf.
Correct.
And
It delays it locally delays the rate of entropy production by producing structure.
Yep. So you get these neg-entropic.
Correct. That's
neg-entropic
moments.
Yeah. And the fact that those exist changes the probabilities that other things will exist, which causes the ratchet to occur more and more and more and more, right?
And therefore, if that's what we're talking about, top-down causality, then if you think of that as my notion of Dennett's free will worth wanting, then we do have the ability to behave in a way that is based on or that issues from meaning, such that it does change the outcome in a society, in an organization.
And so, like, so one of the things that I read the book, and even in this conversation, there you have the past and you have the present. So, like, I just want your meaning to be the future a little bit, right? Like, I want that people can imagine a future, and that it's not just imaginary, that it has causal,
efficacy,
efficacy.
Power.
The way that they imagine the future changes what they might do, what their people around them might do, etc. And that future is entangled, right? It's like you can't imagine just any future. It's cultural, blah, 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 blah. But it's a thing that exists in this meaning way that you're talking about. Like you can imagine that you want the world to be differently than it is, and then you can take actions towards that thing because it has a way of changing the probabilities of your behavior.
Correct. And maybe if in fact meaning is encoded in waveforms, waveforms have beginning, middles, and ends. So in a sense, that's what I was trying to suggest, that this is sort of the complexity way of bringing back teleology. Because the waveform has this tendency to complete itself as that waveform, right? The beginning of a sine wave tends towards a particular vectorial trajectory because it tends to, I'll be anthropomorphic, want to complete itself as a sine curve, correct,
Yep.
and start
Yep.
again, so that the telos, the purposiveness of meaningful behavior, would make sense that it would be encoded in analog form. And I must say, I borrowed this from George Dyson. George Dyson is Freeman Dyson's son. And he's got a book called The Cathedral something or other that apparently all students of Berkeley or Caltech were required to read before they entered as freshmen a number of years ago. And his argument is, have you noticed that in social media, he obviously, I think he passed away before 23 with AI. He says, you know, after a while, it's who's connected to whom on social media. It's the whole analog connectivity pattern that matters, not the energetic consumption. It's the who's connected to whom. Because if you have somebody that's very important, that's the hub, that's more important, regardless of how much energetic consumption there is. And in a sense, we have that in the brain, because I have come to the conclusion that there's something fundamentally wrong with AI as we know it now, for one reason alone. And that is that the human brain, which uses 20% of the body energy, even though it's only 2% of the body part, nonetheless uses not much more energy when it's trying to solve Fermat's last theorem as when it's doodling. And clearly the expenditure of energy with data centers tells us that the architecture of the way we're doing it is different, because otherwise we would have burned our head by trying to figure out Fermat's last theorem or whatever. Correct? So there's something very weirdly off in that regard. And so Dyson's argument was analog apparently uses a lot less and can encode more contextual nuances than digital. And therefore his argument was, we will come to realize that what today, he wouldn't have used that term because it's more recent, AGI, what we're thinking of AGI, will never reach AGI purely with digital architecture. We're going to have to then build an analog layer on top of the digital that includes what? The meaningful aspects, all the ethical aspects, the regulatory aspects, because it will require that to be able to fully encode meaning. And I think that makes some sense. And that's why I was always interested in Patti and Stan Salty's notions of enabling constraints and control theory, and how do most ecosystems keep themselves in balance? It's very interesting. Once the predator eats up all the prey that's available, the system is set up in such a way that then the predators are going to start dying out because there's no food left. And so they have a self-regulatory system, correct, that keeps the system metastable. And we haven't
it's one of the
figured
things I
that
try
out
to point out to
politically,
people all the time,
socially.
because feedback loops are a thing that people like to talk about a lot in our organizational theory. But I keep on trying to point out to people, hey, it's not, maybe it's feedback loop, but it's not really a feedback loop if you can't identify the back pressure, right? Like the squirrels in my backyard in relationship to the acorns in the tree, that's a feedback loop. If they eat all the acorns, they die. So like there's actual back pressure in the feedback loop.
All right.
Otherwise, just like spinning information around the organization. Like if the information doesn't have some sort of effect, it doesn't have some sort of back pressure, you're not actually kind of solving anything in a way. And you can see this in organizational structures where the feedback going one way is stronger than the feedback going the other way. So you get systems where the feedback will flow up but not down, or sideways but not backwards, and it causes distortions really quickly, right? And it's because there's no back pressure in those systems.
So the way to organize the system to be metastable is to have a regulatory mechanism that, see, it used to be that all we did was add redundancy in the sense of, oh, just add another part, so when this one breaks, we have an extra part that we can replace in the early system, right? But this is not what we're talking about now. We're talking about the regulation of the interactions that in the body would constitute homeostasis, would constitute immune health. When the feedback only goes in one direction, you get autoimmune diseases, you get PTSD, right? Because you don't have the metastability level in charge, if you will.
Yeah. And I mean, like, again, in organizational theory, you kind of see this all the time, which is a problem, right? Which is like people, a successful team lead gets promoted to be the manager of teams. But they take the same concept and they just say, now I have more teams.
Correct.
Like I'm doing the same thing just for more teams.
Correct.
What they don't realize is, oh, actually, to create a metastable system would be to start regulating the interactions between the teams in order to stabilize the relationships in positive ways and to destabilize the negative ways, blah, blah, blah. It is in that same like multi-level thing I was talking about earlier, that you're doing a different thing to the same system, but to a completely different part of the system. You need to understand the system in a different way. You need to understand that the parts of the system that you're talking about and thinking about are different things. You're not talking about many teams anymore. You're talking about the interaction between them.
The interaction between the teams. And that's the same with the encephalization means, and I said the problem was the coordination. And so the next level has to worry about the coordination, not just doing the same thing for different teams.
But you get, I mean, again, in organizational structure, you get these problems because on both ends, one, you get like all incentives must be individualized to individuals because it's not fair to incentivize somebody on other people's behaviors. You get that side of it. And then you get the other side of it, which is this idea that leaders or team leads are literally driving the team, which is not the same thing as saying they're integrating the team.
Correct.
Right? It's a completely different conceptual thing that the leader should be doing at that point in time. And it's, this, again, it's the positivists, individualization stuff that's happening everywhere. And frankly, like the Chicago school, which was populated by a bunch of crazy positivists, and then they infected the US government everywhere, and that you could calculate the answer to all sorts of social problems, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff, it's throughout organizational design theory everywhere. So,
well, it's also through the educational system, which is what makes it so insidious, right? Like and one of the things, Alicia, that you mentioned in the book, and that I want to just touch on briefly because it's been a thread that's gone all the way through, is linear causation and circular causation.
Yes.
And because you've been dancing around it for a while now, and that the positivists were like linear causation.
And in part because efficient causality is linear causation in general too. And even Aristotle thought that the cosmos operated on linear causality. Aristotle was the first to posit, he didn't call it God, he called it a prime mover. And that is Z gets caused by Y, Y gets caused by X, X gets caused, you go back, and then Aristotle's reasoning was this cannot go on forever. Therefore, there must be a prime mover, but notice that prime mover has to be outside of the chain of causation because otherwise you could ask what caused it. So, and what's amazing to me is that even during the scientific revolution in the 17th century, when they discarded formal cause, they discarded purpose and final cause, nobody ever questioned circular causality. Ever. So the idea of circular causality is a no-no, and that's why, what's his name? Edelman's neurology, where he posits reentrant loops going from the sensory receptors up to the brain and then going back out and changing for example, the sensitivity of the sensory input and versa, the coming input would change the attunement of the brain to what's going on out there. That was so radical, because the idea was, how can you have circular causality? You had exactly the same problem with the notion of feedback, or the epistemological version of feedback, which was abduction, that it would change the priors of the brain to then rethink what the likelihood of the next step might be. That was a no-no. And so all of that was complete. So when you look at people like, what's his name, Taylor, who did all the time and motion studies at the beginning, there's no feedback from the poor schmuck sitting on the desk doing the conveyor belt stuff, right? There's really, hey, look, I can't take this, I can't go any faster. They didn't have any of that. So it all had to be linear. And I think it was, again, biology, and especially ecology, the study of ecosystems, that showed us that there's an awful lot of feedback loops. But again, that's one of the reasons why biology was not considered a hard science, because it did not have absolute laws from which you could crank out precise predictions. Couldn't do it. And so biologists were the first to sort of push back against the whole Newtonian linear causality notion. But instead of paying attention to them, people thought, well, these folks are not really science. Not to mention economics, definitely not science. Not to mention social science, definitely not science. Psychology, forget it. On and on and on, because circular causality was not in the works. But then the question of the closure of the physical in physics kind of said, well, you're barking, you are trying to win a battle that you will never win, because there is such a thing as closure of the physical, and that matter is neither created nor destroyed. And if in fact these emergent properties could change the go of things, to use Peirce's phrase, then you would be violating the law of conservation of matter and energy. End of story. That's never going to work. It was, I think, Prigoghine's understanding of dissipated structures, where he said, look, you don't go against the second law of thermodynamics, but you delay it enough through the formation of structure that it in fact increases energy dissipation. So he was able to have his cake and eat it too, in that sense, which is a sort of a form of feedback. But in general, to this day, philosophers really have not done much with mereological logic, for example.
So, like, really quickly, to point out why this might be super interesting for people in this channel, one of the kind of implications of this is root cause analysis, things like this, linear causality and systems. And there's so root cause analysis is taking this logic and going down the stack, right? The other one is systems thinkers have a tendency to do this too. They try to go up the stack to get closer to God's view, right? And they think that if they can every level up in the system, the bigger they can illustrate the system, the more control they have over the system, because they're effectively closer to the prime mover at that point, right? These are all like system thinkers would never say what I just said, but that's the implication that the behaviors they seem to be performing. And so one of the interesting things for people to look at, I think, that comes out of this as complexity theorists is ideas like safety too. So where this idea that we've been talking about around causality, circular causality, constraints, but also distributed agency, mean that having a system be safe, you cannot simply say the reason the plane fell out of the sky was because the pilot did it. Because that actually, it's the linear causal description. That will never produce a more safe airplane, right? In fact, you have to say, what was the context the pilot was in when they made these decisions? how did that context inform those decisions, and how can we modify those contexts in ways that shift the probabilities towards
Exactly.
less planes falling out of the sky. This
Exactly.
is safety two theory, and this is an important part, I think, of really thinking through complexity theory's implications in incidence response,
Causality,
causality,
yeah,
design of
absolutely.
organizations. So
Absolutely. But it requires that you think anew, really radically think anew. And in general, the easiest thing is to try to come up with the fifth decimal point of what's already there and say, look, this decimal point will solve the problem that the fourth decimal point didn't. And likelihood is it's not going to, because you cannot reduce a relationship to a node. You cannot reduce the edge of a network to a node.
that's right. Yep.
Right? And so in order to understand network properties, you've got to understand the edges and the nodes and how one informs the other. And see, and it's interesting because the word information harkens back to Plato's notion of forms, because it is but people tend to think of forms as shapes. But Plato never thought of forms as shapes, because justice was a form, but justice doesn't have a shape. It's an S. Then that got translated into essences, and the essence or the essential properties. But no, essential properties are always embedded in a context. And even now, I think complexity theorists, way back when people started talking about epigenetics, were going, yay, we're vindicated. Woohoo! See, it's not that it's changing the gene at all, but it's changing the timing in which the gene is expressed, the strength of the activation of the gene, the moment of the activation of the gene. And that's why I use the examples like which I really like, the swing in the playground. The kid who's trying to learn how to swing on a swing early on tends to think, if I kick harder, but it's not do I kick harder, it's when do I kick that makes the difference in a swinging. Correct? So it's timing. And so it's all these other constraints that themselves do not impart energy that are really important, but we don't think in those terms.
That's right.
Yeah. Or people go, oh, well, context doesn't really matter. Right. Tell somebody who's trying to bake bread in Denver or up in the Himalayas, and they're not taking into account the atmospheric pressure that oven is sitting in. Unless you adjust the temperature and the length of the time the bread's in the oven, it's not going to work. See, and so people, oh, well, yeah, I guess context does matter. Yes, right. And that's, but thinking that way is hard for people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think
we need, all right, Jabe, you finish up,
one
and then
last
I think we're
question.
gonna open it to questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
One last thing. Like I also tend to think that one of the things that's confusing about context for people is I think that a significant way to modify context is to remove things from the context. It's not simply additive. In fact, often what we're doing in order to modify our behaviors is removing things from the context that we're in, right?
Yeah.
And so modification of the context isn't just adding more and more stuff, which is again the problem with building bigger and bigger data centers to get bigger and bigger context. It's actually being selective about what context we're exposing ourselves to. And allowing that context to help us make decisions better. It's partially about curating
Correct.
what we're exposing ourselves
Which
to.
is what I would call, in a sense, regulate. It's the regulatory, pay attention to what you pay attention to, as they say,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Correct. And that's the regulatory mechanism, because the attention mechanism is running fine, but it can go haywire if there is no regulation. Unless you have a ratchet that stabilizes it, you'll simply have the feedback loop of a microphone gone crazy,
Right.
right? And screeching. Correct.
Yeah.
So you need a stabilization, and I want to call that the constitutive constraint, or the regulatory, or the governing constraint. That is what keeps it stable. And it gets me out of the negative implications of the word hierarchy of control of authoritarian diktat kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay. While you guys are organizing yourself with questions, raise your hand and we'll ask for Alicia, questions for Alicia. But before we do that, I just want to say, Alicia, this is a wonderful book. I enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you.
The full title of the book is Why Context Matters, or Where Anglo Philosophy Went Wrong. And you do not have to get very far into the book before you figure out that it wasn't just Anglo-American philosophy that went wrong this way. And you also mentioned a couple of my favorite new books, one of which is a new book. It's called The Women Are Up to Something by Benjamin Liscombe, and it is about those 4 female Oxford philosophers that Alicia referenced. And the other one is a very old book, which is Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Oh, yes, yes.
And it really demonstrates that thing you were talking about how we need to silo these people, because it is that Adam Smith we're talking about.
Right.
The Wealth of Nations guy that you all studied.
Yeah.
The Theory of Moral Sentiments is actually, go ahead.
He taught ethics. He taught
Yeah.
ethics. There was no such thing as economics back then.
Yeah.
He taught ethics. Yeah. And the invisible hand is, in a sense, the earliest notion of distributed control.
Yeah.
In principle, as a principal mechanism of distributed control, supposedly. Yeah, it's interesting. It's nice walking around Edinburgh when you all of a sudden see, oh, there's David Hume's statue on one corner, and 2 blocks away is Adam Smith. That's really cool.
Yeah,
we don't do that in America.
Yeah, they were friends, weren't they? Or at least colleagues.
They were sort of contemporary. They were close
yeah.
enough contemporaries. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. All right. Any questions? I saw a hand up, then it went down. Okay. Basir? I believe you were
Hello,
up first.
Alicia.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you very much for your generous
thank you.
knowledge and challenging us. I'm going to talk about a setting you are very familiar, a philosophy department, and I found myself in a major discussion. So basically, a quarrel broke out because a graduate student exceeded his designated time. And the interesting thing is, the philosophers, the professors, brought it to a very high level of conflict, but just below, confrontation, physical violence, or escalating it. But the thing is, the whole discussion kept on going and going and going. And it went so extensively that at one point the building went into a lockdown. So everyone had to leave through the fire exits. And of course, the quarrel carried on and on.
Oh my goodness.
We just ignored them. I mean, we weren't part of the group, but I've left. And then 5 minutes later, they arrived to a road and they are continuing the discussion. High level tension and discussion, but very respectful, but really exploratory. Like they were given to real and very respectful. How can we bring it to our domains? Thank you.
How can we bring respect to our domains? Oh my goodness. We're assuming that people believe in the value of cordiality and respectability. And if that's not there, then you can have as many rules as you want, but it's very difficult to avoid the escalation, right? So I'm sorry, I wish I had an answer, but in a sense, it presupposes the value of cordiality and respect and so on. And if that's not there, then it doesn't matter how many rules we have, it doesn't seem to hold.
Very true. I mean, I was very impressed with that. If I'm thinking.
Thank you.
Unmute yourself, Barbara. Okay, Bernard, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks a lot, Alicia. I was really very impressed. When I read the title of this session in the invite, I thought, oh, Alicia is finally going to talk about a topic that I've been brooding over for the last 15 years or so. And then I have realized now that yes, you are, but at the same time, you are following a parallel, a slightly different thread from where I've built it. I'm more so focused on the social sciences and the theory of science around the social sciences. So coming from the Neo-Kantian school, you know, Weber, Richard Windelband, going
Yes,
through
yes.
the understanding, explaining debate that suddenly stopped in the Anglo-American world, whereas it went on in the continent. And so, I don't know, Barbara, Jocko, if you like, I would make an offer to continue that conversation by having a talk, if you like to have me, about why complexity science, how complexity science could profit from that, neo-Kantian theory of science.
I think in the book, I do look at attempts to incorporate Kant. And my conclusion was those went nowhere. After, in the Anglo-American world, the idea that the mind was built in with categories, transcendental categories of possibility, that I think after Frege was not going to fly in the Vienna Circle and their heirs. And the idea that human beings had the rational capacity to intuit the moral law within. Kant has a phrase about there's the starry sky above and the moral law within. Well, the categories weren't going to really get us to ontology, because at best what happens then is all we can know is what the world appears to us to be. And the empiricism of the Vienna Circle and positivism wanted to really get beyond that. And the idea that the mind could intuit not feelings, it wasn't an emotional thing about morality. It was that humans had a rational understanding of moral laws. You get the people like Quine and Pritchard in the UK, who had a little bit of an attempt to they talked about moral intuitionism. And that, I mentioned it in the book because it's very interesting. R.M. Hare had been a member of the Oxford World, and he was one of the few that actually we know of. They all kind of fought in the war, but a lot of them were back home doing the work with Turing and the predicting where the best landing place in Normandy was going to be and that sort of thing. But Hare actually was in the Burma theater, and he was on the march to the River Kwai. And then he built that bridge and railroad, and then they sent him back to Singapore with the rest of the POWs. And he explicitly says that he did not want to talk about his experiences again, but he didn't write about it, but in personal conversations, he was asked, and apparently what he was incredibly horrified was that the intuition of the Japanese officers about the treatment of the prisoners was completely different, of course, from the intuition of the prisoners themselves. And the idea that we have a universal human moral sense, in a sense, was shattered. And so what Hare does, H-A-R-E, R.M. Hare, H-A-R-E, very famous, he comes up with a theory of morality, and his book is called The Language of Morals, as I recall, that is called prescriptivism. And in a sense, it's an attempt to do a neo-Kantianism. But unlike Kant, he didn't think you could ground the universalization of moral commands in reason. So and I think then the images of Guernica, the images of the bomb situation after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Dresden, not to mention the opening of the camps in Auschwitz and or the rest of it, that kind of put an end to anybody who was trying to claim human beings had moral intuition. And that certainly got eliminated on the continent in favor of the existentialists. I mentioned in the book, Iris Murdoch worked with the UN refugees on UN, what's it called? Something on refugees after the Second World War. And she spoke French. And so she read Sartre and de Beauvoir there, and she realized in 1945 that Anglo-American philosophy could use a healthy dose of existentialism. And she also realized it was never going to fly. And that's what caused Iris Murdoch, to leave the academy in philosophy at Oxford and just write literature. And to her dying day, she said to Philippa Foot, I was never going to be a philosopher. Philippa Foot agreed. But what did that mean? It meant that I would never be able to do philosophy a la Oxford, a la K. So I am going to write literature. And she got the Pulitzer. She was very recognized for her novels. And within novels, she would have, for example, she'd speak about human sensitivity and attunement to context. She has a very famous mother fable that she then, that Philippa Foot said, I don't know what Murdoch is talking about when she talks about this garbage kind of thing. It was really interesting. And it was a reaction to the attempt to do some neo-Kantian ethics after the Second World War by people like, well, Van Orman Quine had been earlier, and Pritchard had too between the wars. That just did. I think the images, the experience of bombed cities in Europe in the Second World War, plus the images of the newsreels, people going to the movie theaters, to the newsreels and seeing them, I think was tantamount to the experience in America with the photographs from Abu Ghraib or from the My Lai massacre. The context it was very hard to dismiss in favor of the notion of moral intuition. I'd love to know if that way that I've looked at it is either at least plausible. I had a professor who gave me such a horrible grade on an essay I wrote that on the front page of the essay, he said, Alicia, I know clarity is not enough, but I think it is at least necessary. Oh, geez. This is absolutely awful. But, in philosophy, it's famous that, well, some things are not even false, they're nonsensical, and that comes from the positivists. So my question is, I would love to have a conversation, but to see if that interpretation, but I do have almost a chapter on that in the book, I think. If I remember, I ended up cutting a lot of stuff, and sometimes I forget what I cut and what I didn't. But...
Now, Bernard, we will talk because February's open. So let's talk about that talk you mentioned. There were a couple of questions in the chat. Bernard, did that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
good. Okay, so we have a few things. Dave Knoll asked about a technologist perspective. Philosophy, is it better for the philosophy without ethics is better for the bank account? Would that be self-centered pragmatism? That's Dave's question.
What would be pragmatism? The what?
Well, he said philosophy without Go ahead, Dave. Yeah.
Say that again.
Dave, go.
Sort of when you strip ethics. So in technology development, if you sort of strip ethics out of it, then what you're basically, it benefits the bank account of the person who owns the technology. And you could almost call that the school of self-centered pragmatism.
Well, pragmatism was a theory that, the technical form of pragmatism, not our probably sometimes more common use of the term pragmatism. Pragmatism as we use it today in everyday conversation sort of means a practical, correct?
Right.
Whereas
And
pragmatism,
that's how I'm using it, more in like common level.
yeah, I think that's true. I am very interested nowadays in looking at the discussions of people, for example, who work at DeepMind and Google, people like Shane Legg, people like Dennis Habavis, who work in the DeepMind section, how the question of how the training of these AI models are attempting to prevent output that is ethically bad, ethically unsatisfactory, and how one goes about doing that. The question, of course, I think that you're mentioning is that in the end analysis, will the financial advantages outweigh all these other guardrails that they are trying to place on them? And that is and the only way to do that, I think, would be probably with an international kind of agreement, and that seems not to be in the works for others.
Right.
So it's a serious issue, because the consequences are absolutely horrendous in the case of AGI, in particular, if we are getting close to it. Serious issue.
Okay.
Yeah, and the impact of the feedback loops is much more severe on people lower in the system.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We have a few more hands up. Thank you, Dave. Yulia, you had your hand up, down. Now it's up again. Is it up?
Yeah, it's up. It's totally up after such a sapiophilic satisfaction that you provided us with.
Julia, you're too nice. Thank you.
I mean, I'm much closer to naming another word here, but I'm waiting for the peak here. I really was thinking about how much it would be amazing to hear you. It was amazing to hear you with Jabe, of course, but also I think it would be amazing to hear you talking with a linguist who's been brought in a concept analysis. So I've done my fair bit, but I'm not in the field for the last 10 years. But everything that you are saying seems to be so much, you mentioned the word mirrored, but I would say projected to the linguistics, specifically in the concept theory as well. Because when you are saying about the meaning, when you're saying about this idea of the sign and of the notion and of then how do we call the concept, how do we name it, then how do we describe it, then how do we talk about it, how do we talk about it without saying the word, which brings us to the idiomatic level. It's just because of the concept theory has evolved so much that we even have the LLMs, because this is large language models.
Right.
And the idea that you were describing, the emerging factor of it, right? So the emerging property of every node. But this is exactly what the concept theory does, because it goes into understanding what are the atoms and bosons and fluons of each concept of the language, and then how this concept evolves through time when you were talking about temporary and temporarily, and located as well, because in one language the concept would mean very different ways of how we're talking about a specific tree, I don't know, linden tree or tillol tree or anything else. We would have different descriptors, but we would also have different pop culture songs, metaphors, and so on. And therefore, in this concept theory, you would have this kind of a shot of what the concept is, a node in what you're saying is at this moment, at this type of its evolution, and in this language, which opens up to comparative concept analysis, but also the waves you were talking about. Yeah, because when you say the word was used in a specific time, in a specific culture, so this resonates so amazingly with that. I would really love to hear you talk to a person who is much better in this category, because I would assume that that would be such an enriching conversation. You mentioned that the philosophy is not good when it is not a la Harvard, and then the social sciences are not as good as hard science. But I also think that most of philosophy came from language studies. Most of current technology that is Gen AI or whatever you call it comes from language studies, from digital linguistics, and from concept analysis. So I really hope that the force ground, the frontier of linguistics also speaks to complexity and also speaks to philosophy, because in a way philosophy and linguistics is the very close parts. I received so much pleasure, I may say that, through your conversation, and I really want to appreciate your work and to thank you and thank everybody for organizing this. This was simply beautiful.
Thank you, Julia. I do think that the fact that we are, or that complexity theory as I think of it, is always about open systems, far from equilibrium, that therefore that makes the two-way street between, say, linguistics and conceptual analysis it has to go both ways. And so if I speak of closure at any point with regards to complex systems, it's not about the closure of energy and matter, but it's rather the closure of maybe a semantic concept, an idea, information and forms and absolute reality. They all originated in the same. I mean, Plato never used the word information, and I don't think he was particularly concerned with linguistic analysis, but even somebody like Chomsky, who recently thought that it was all built in, which was kind of, if you allow me, maybe a sort of a neo-Kantian notion of linguistics, that now we understand how the recursive nature of the use of language in a particular culture modifies both, in a sense. So yes, thank you. I think that's a very important notion. And as Jay was suggesting, if reductionists were always looking down, we don't want to make the mistake of just only looking up towards the systemic. The key, I think, is to find, and I think that's what complex adaptive systems gives us, wholes, WHOLES, coherent dynamics that allow a measure of autonomy and individuality to the components of that whole. The organization of a novel and emergent whole dynamic is not the formation of a fused block. It is the organization of a very articulated, meta-stable constraint regime, I want to say, that allows each component a measure of independence, flexibility, that there are many paths that are possible to achieve the same outcome. You get that in biology a lot, and I always joke saying that in biology is called degeneracy. Degeneracy is when you have a lot of different, for example, enzymatic pathways that can produce the same protein. But you also have the reverse. The same protein under different contexts can produce different outputs under different contexts. And so we have to be able to allow for that. And I don't know if to call it indeterminacy. I have friends who want to call it indeterminacy. It's certainly not linear. It's certainly not one cause, one effect, end of story. It is a much more fluid, dynamic, and so therefore the constraints have to be at the semantic level, have to be at the more general level. I think that's and we see that in the brain. Apparently, when people learn, for example, chess, or they learn to play the piano or a difficult musical instrument, when they're first starting, each input goes to one neuron in that a particular part of the brain. And then apparently there is a phase transition that apparently is fairly discrete. And all of a sudden, once the person has acquired that skill, and especially if they become masters or experts at it, a concert pianist level, a grandmaster chess player, it switches to a different part of the brain. And if Jabe would say, well, that's the ratchet that is stabilizing, and that node can stabilize in a different part of the brain, but it always has to be open to the possibility of, ooh, wait a minute, the opponent did something entirely different, so I've got to focus again on and see if I make a different transition. So yes, thank you.
When you were talking about information, somebody wrote in the chat that form is Gestalt in German, and then we come back to Wittgenstein, and again we are coming back to the sign, to the form, to the image, and then
thank you for saying that. That's another one I forgot about. Gestalt psychology.
Exactly.
Oh, God forbid that should be considered epistemology. That was another one I have in the book, saying that was just, set aside because the idea back then in agreement with the Newtonian atomism and so on was that the perception was of particulate individual sense datum. So the Vienna Circle took to, for example, pointillism beautifully. Oh, all we ever see are these little dots. And the image you see in a pointillist painting, that's the human mind constructing it. Gestalt psychology is the exact opposite. No, we see the entire scene. And that was never going to be part of Anglo-American philosophy. Oh, well, let the psychologists worry about that one. We're not going to worry about that one. Thank you. I forgot to mention, I do have it in the book, but it was amazing to think of Gestalt psychology also falling into this. No,
Thank
God
you so
forbid.
much.
This is not what we do. You're muted, Barbara.
Of course I am, because I've only been doing this for 6 years and I still forget to unmute myself. Okay, Shin, you're up.
Okay.
Hi, Shin.
Hey, Alicia.
How are you?
I'm good. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your interaction with our mystery guest. I was guessing who that's gonna be. Really enjoyed the energy between the two of you as well. So my probing and my questions, maybe in plural, are really about the applicability, or rather the designability of all this in the organizational space. And in particular, who are responsible for designing this? Whose agency is this predicated upon? Are former leaders or a person like me? And all that. So I just want to start from fatalism. It's something what I experience very much in organizations. It's like you often hear, talking about these in the context. People often use this, Drucker quote, like culture eats strategy for breakfast to say, there's nothing I can do. It's all the system. It's the system's fault. It's the culture. I can do nothing, right? It's just little me. And it's just like the other end of the feedback loop. I'm not going to give anything back. I'm not going to use my agency to influence the system in any possible ways where I stand. And so that's one thing. And I was just like thinking, you know, if we truly want to make this thing designable, what that is designable? The enabling constraint? I would love to see more of these constitutive constraints, like the regulatory, the metastable, self-emerging things to be there. But it's very hard. The more everywhere I look, it's more like the governing constraint somebody wants to impose top down, and it's not working the circular way. So I would really want to hear your view on. I know last time somebody asked this, you said, "Oh, I'm a philosopher. I'm not."
Yeah, I think that tends to be my answer. No, but I think, for example, the notion that if you think of my idea of there being context independent constraints, and that takes the system away from equiprobability. So what are you guys talk a lot about minimum viable product. I was thinking the other day of, are there such thing as minimum viable constraints? Now, could there be minimum viable enabling constraints? All right. What's the minimum set of constraints? Like I mentioned the Bao plan in the development of an organism, the minimum that you need in order to ensure that you end up with a system that doesn't fall apart immediately, right? That you've, but on the other hand, you want it to be flexible enough, and that's the role of the minimum, that would be able, in response to an open environment, namely feedback from the users or feedback from the employees or feedback from the markets or feedback from everybody simultaneously, would then be able, and that I think is what Jabe tried to do in his dissertation, and that is to design a system of design that is dynamic and ends up being automatically modifiable as it is used, correct? Am I correct? That's what he was trying to do in the dissertation, rather than designing it ahead of time for a particular context, because that implicitly assumes that context won't change that much. Whereas taking seriously the fact that the context is local, is changeable, and therefore how can I design, and this is particularly difficult, I think, for international corporations, because how do all international corporations start as local corporations and then become international? No, they used to. It used to start out as a local firm, and then they'd expect, and then of course they'd hit their head against the wall when they're in a new culture. So the question is, now how do you design it? How do you get this minimum viable constraint, both enabling and context independent, so that then it becomes like an epigenetic system where the world becomes its own model, the context becomes its own model in that particular location. And the only thing I can think of as an example that I really loved, and it's when I read Mohammed Yunus's books on micro lending a long time ago, and he used as an example, Unilever in India decided it was going to sell 1 bar of soap, period, 1 bar of soap alone. And they discovered that given the context, people could afford 1 bar of soap. And they did beautifully with that new marketing strategy. And that to me is a beautiful example of, well, what would happen if, what will the world amplify as a strategy? And the answer has to be, it will amplify a strategy that it resonates to. And so in a sense, the individual CEO, I don't know where Unilever was headquartered back then, but wherever somebody had to be able to design an enabling constraint that was flexible enough to allow the local branch in New Delhi or wherever they were based in India to just decide, oh, well, let's try this and see if that would work. So starting out with a minimal viable constraint that will ensure the thing is not going to fall apart is like the equivalent of making sure the bowel plan in a fetus. That's a non-starter. You don't get that, you get a miscarriage. It's the end of story. But then having the rest of the constraints be flexible enough that they can be generative and epigenetic and allow the environment and the history of that particular location to come up with a to alter the topology, to use Jabe's notion, both by removing constraints or adding possibilities, adding options. Chris Matz would love the notion of adding options, right? So that you are then able, but that requires a lot of coordination. So that's then the supervisory. See, what I consider governing constraint is that constitutive constraint that's acting as a governance constraint that is flexible and robust enough to allow for that to happen, which means the coordinating capacity and the anticipatory capacity of those coordinating constraints has to be what gets focused on, because there's no sense coordinating for today. You've got to coordinate so that that coordinating regulation is capable of adapting to tomorrow and to a different location. So that's the 30,000 view of the answer to your question. But in a sense, I am saving myself by saying, if it's really going to be context sensitive, I can't give you an answer for every single case, right? But the point being, it has to be context dependent. And so how granular you're going to go, you're going to have to decide, well, look, we can distribute so far, but after a certain level of granularity, we're going to have to rely on local distributors. And so then what kind of relationship are we going to have with those local distributors so they don't screw up what we're trying to do higher up, but yet we can take advantage of their knowledge of the local situation to maybe even modify the constraint we have a bit higher, that sort of thing. So I
Right.
think.
Yeah. Can I ask Jabe, did you hear the earlier part of this conversation? I was just I want to ask you as a follow-up, who are the designers? Whose responsibility is it in this system of design? Is it the formal leaders? Is it the team leads, as you mentioned, or is it everybody like me, architects and conveners of different gatherings?
So,
Yeah.
So my argument that I've made for a long time is that organizations have multiple temporal and ontological layers. And there's a temporality and ontology that's related to each layer, right? So a team has a certain time frame and a certain set of things that it looks at and it thinks is valid, right? So teams talk about certain kinds of things. They don't talk about like global problems usually. They don't talk about like, how the factory got built, right? They talk about certain things, certain ontological things, right? And so the designers that are trying to help improve the performance of that team should be considering the ontological and epistemological concerns of that team. They know about certain things in certain kinds of ways. And if you want to change what they know about, you either need to change what they're looking at, change the ontological considerations they're making, or how they know about the things that they're looking about. That is designing of the process and organizational structure inside the team. Now, it just happens, and this is why I like neurological recursion, that if you go up a level, often the designer up here is just designing how the teams work together. So their ontological considerations are the teams. That's what they're thinking about. And how they know about those teams are things like, measurement, metrics, performance reports, blah, blah, blah. So what they know about, what they think about, is about those types of things. And this is what causes significant problems inside organizations because team members will go, why are you talking about us like we're parts? We're not parts, we're a whole. Like you're minimizing and reducing us to something else. And it's like, no, that would be true if I were inside the team and talking about us like that. But I am not inside. I am talking about a completely different view of the organization. Same thing. I'm looking at the same like overall thing. We're still talking about IBM, but I'm talking about like a part of IBM, a specific ontological temporal concern. And so the designers live at those different levels. Now, architects, I think, tend to be people who are responsible for managing up and down. That's their specific concern is I am trying to help people operating in a sprint leaf way every 2 weeks to understand the implications of their decision on a 3 to 6 month time cycle. So I am responsible for helping them understand the decisions that they're making on the long-term impact of what they're able to do in the future. Yeah. And that's what I'm trying to do is bridge those different temporalities. That's what makes it a unique skill or unique role is you're explaining temporalities across these domains. And so again, I think it's a little bit like an architect's a little bit like a biologist trying to talk to a physicist. Like they're trying to explain higher level concepts to people who are concerned about lower level concepts. They're trying to say like if you make these types of decisions, this is the implication on the long term stuff that's going to happen. So that I think that's the thing to understand. There's like designing inside the team, designing across the ontological set, and then designing across the temporal set. That makes sense?
And they're different kinds of interfaces, whether you're intra level or inter level. There are different kinds of bridges, different kinds of constraints that are involved. Correct.
And you get in trouble, right? This is what we point out too. If you start talking about hierarchies and people immediately hear you talking about hierarchies of control, this is the problem architects have all the time is they get accused of being ivory tower people. It's like, no. I'm just managing a different part of the system. I'm trying to design, enable, blah, blah, blah. So like one of the ways to think about it is like people tend to think of the architects as being top down. But if you take Alicia's kind of ideas, you say, no, I'm designing the context. I'm designing the bottom up. I'm designing the enabling conditions for you to work in these tight time frames. I'm not above you. I'm below you. And Akoff and a bunch of these other thinkers would point out here, like this is like the most critical kind of thing that gets lost all the time. Managers think that they should be managing the team. Who's managing the system, the context, right? Who's managing the context? And the answer is that when things get like pressured and weird because of the positive threads that we've been talking about this whole time, people tend to collapse into, I need to go manage the team. And it's like, yeah, well, that I don't know if they need more management of the current temporality that they're in. I think what they need is for you to increase the probabilities that they have in the future of being successful, which means you need to manage the context they're in, not themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thanks for that clarification. Good to see you.
Good to see you again, Jim.
Okay. Matteo. Thank you for being
everybody.
the most patient person in the world, Matteo.
Hi, Matteo. How are you? Hi, Matteo.
Good day, good day. I'm curious. Thanks, Julia. You kind of took away a certain part of my question about Gestalt psychology. I'm a bit more curious because during the end, you said that it's quite evident to people living through the First and also the Second World War that moral intuition is kind of shattered, right? But I mean, I've read the book which I briefly posted in the chat, which is what was it? Ordinary Men, right? The Final Solution in Poland.
Yeah.
Right. You have certain it seems that there is always this kind of fringes, the kind of tail with extreme high variance where people have moral intuition and act on those, right? You had a very small minority of these policemen that withdrew from said choice. right? So it's like the kind of minority. I mean, that's Kierkegaard again, kind of setting the moral tone. So I'm curious why you claim beforehand that there is no moral intuition per se.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that probably people like R.M. Hare, in particular, who developed prescriptivism in response to the more neo-Kantian notion that there is moral intuition, he was looking at, for example, in the same situation, namely a POW camp in Singapore run by Japanese officers, why was the intuition, moral intuition of the British and foreign POWs so different, and their conclusion that this behavior is equivalent of torture, whereas the Japanese officers would never have thought of it as torture. This is standard operating procedure of the way you treat prisoners, period, end of story. I think that's what shattered the belief that there are universal. And again, remember, I really do believe that the whole Newtonian mechanical positivist worldview, when they speak about determinism and they speak about linear causality, they meant universal and strict determinism, a la Donald Davidson, meaning given sort of a Laplacian determinism. Again, Laplacian sort of channeled Newton 150 years later when Napoleon asked him, what about morality? And Laplace kind of said, I don't have need of that hypothesis either, correct? Because the assumption is, given all these pre-existing conditions and these universal laws, this is what is going to happen to everyone at all times and in all places. And that's what shocked Hare, I think. And when I say it wasn't accepted, what I mean is by the Anglo-American academic ethical establishment, ethics establishment. I don't mean by people on the street in general, which kind of again shows you the disconnect between philosophy in academia and the average person, which I think is one of the things that the continental side was trying to at least grapple with. So that's all I meant. Not that people in general would have thought that. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think also like during the World War, you get a weird inversion, right? So like this is kind of the Arendtian concept of the banality of evil.
Evil, correct.
It used to be that evil was the exceptional thing.
Correct.
What she's saying is like, oh, plenty of people are evil. Like just being a normal human is just part of those people are just, they're not exceptional. The exceptional people are the people who go out of the way to act against evil in her argument, right? And then you get Midgley's version too, which is wickedness, which is basically the idea that of reduction applied to morality. The what is wicked is being concerned about a sole concept, a single thing. That's wickedness. Like I only care about one thing, and that instead, not being wicked is about having a multiplicity of concerns, all counterbalancing each other, and making it so that it's not easy to make the decision that you're making. It's not obvious all the time because you're like balancing a network of things as opposed to a single thing. So, yeah.
Which also leads to the distinction that Isaiah Berlin made between the hedgehogs and the foxes. I never know which is which. The fox knows one thing, or is it the hedgehog? I can't remember which is which. But again, I think the Newtonian worldview, the positivist worldview, is a very it's very univocal. That's it. And it all fits into this particular frame. Whereas appreciating the multiplicity and the diversity is messy. And so anytime you have multiplicity and diversity, there seems to be this call for law and order. The attempt to shoehorn it all into a univocal frame from which we can derive easy, morality then becomes a check-off list, right? Check, check, check. All right, so this is what you do. You don't have to think. Whereas when you have a multiplicity and a diversity of and a layered of the dimensions, and all right, it works in this dimension, but that if you did it in this dimension, then it would affect this other dimension horribly, and so on. It forces you to really grapple with all the individual content, individual domains, individual dimensions, individual culture, individual everything, and jiggle them in such a way that you're trying to balance it. And Midgley does say something about, well, in fact, reasoning and morality is a question of mutual adjustments of all of these. I once heard somebody from Cuba in favor of the Cuban government says, you know what I most like about, there's an American phrase I love, and I hadn't thought about it much. He said, Americans use the phrase, oh, I can live with that. That is a beautiful phrase because in a sense it encapsulates compromise. I'm not getting everything I want. The output's not going to work out exactly the way I would if I were designing a Newtonian beautiful system. But that's okay. I can live with that. And we have forgotten that. And I believe that's incredibly important. Speaking of language and linguistics, I tend to mention this and I'm not proud of it, but the word compromise in Spanish does not in any of the Spanish cultures have the connotation that is positive. It has the connotation of I compromised my principles.
Yeah.
Yes, it has that interpretation, but it does not have the notion of compromise that is at least part of the foundation of the American experiment. And I think if we forget that, it is a horrendous loss. That compromise has a respect to the other person that, I respect you enough that I am willing to give up this amount on my end. Well, there might be this point beyond which I cannot compromise. What is it? I stand where I can do no other, said Martin Luther or something at the door of the whatever cathedral. But that complexity's multiple realizability, meaning it is not a fused whole, means that each individual component has its integrity, that if you don't respect that integrity, the whole thing kind of starts falling apart. And I think that's a very important social lesson that we forget at our horrendous peril, the value, the positive value of compromise, and what it implies for the way we respect other people. The mitochondria doesn't stop being a mitochondrion once it's inside a cell. Once the eukaryotes got emerged and evolved, right? The eukaryotes are not the Washington Monument obelisk, a fused static piece of rock, correct? It is an articulated, a eukaryote is in a sense not a thing, although the fact that it has a membrane kind of makes it a thing, but also eukaryotes, unlike prokaryotes, the prokaryotes had rigid membranes, call them walls. The eukaryotes have interfaces and membranes that are porous and that adjust depending on the environment they're in. That was a positive evolution. That was not we do not go back to regress by creating walls in order to maintain our integrity. The integrity is maintained by the meaning, the sense making of the interface, I would think. So that's as far as I get in getting myself into trouble here.
Well, We have two clarifying questions from the chat, and then I think we're going to wrap it up because we've kept you a really long time. The first is from Thomas Vanderwall, and he asks, for clarity, is there a conflation between culture and systems?
Oh, very nice. Well, in a sense, the culture is the systemic level, correct, of a social organism, of a social dynamic. Because we speak of the culture of an organism, of a corporation, right? Of a firm. So it's the systemic values that are embodied in the constraint regime of that firm, correct? That's the culture, I would think. And so I think the reason philosophers were very interested in the notion of feral animals or sort of this Rousseau state of nature was, well, what happens if you raise a human being, biologically human being, in a feral, and if they have no cultural, well, they couldn't have survived without a mother to feed them, correct? So is there ever the possibility of a feral situation with human beings? Probably not. They would have died, correct? And the fact that our childhood is longer than any other animal tells you something about that importance, correct? A baby gazelle runs within minutes after being born or whatever, but we take a year if we're not acculturated, and we would die. So I think there is a relationship between system and culture, but we don't use the word. Well, yes, we do. You culture a biological specimen. Yes, we do use the word culture even for biology, right? You take a tissue and it is, you have to culture it to see if it's got oncological.
You're bringing outside influence into it.
Correct. Very nice. Very nice. Yeah, very nice. So that's my answer. I think there is, broadly speaking, for both system and culture. Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. All right. And then our second question is from Trent Hone, who had to leave.
Trent.
Yeah, Trent, he had to go.
That's okay. I'll talk.
All right. So Trent says, how much is the desire for a single solution, in quotes, a product of a particular social construct? Does the desire for this solution exist without Newtonian, or the kind of mix that Newtonian mechanics, or does the desire for this exist without, or the kind of mix that Newtonian mechanics emerged from?
That's interesting, because I would say, you think of fight or flight. In the case of a poor animal in the forest, and they would much rather have false positives than one false negative, right? Because it gets eaten by the predator. So there's probably a desire for a single solution that gets you survival, maybe. So avoiding false, am I correct here? Avoiding false negatives, that this thing is going to kill me, would probably lead to a biological. I've always heard people say all cultures are afraid of snakes, or you might think, or red mushrooms. You go, well, that probably is a ratchet that got encoded at some point. Hey, this might, you might have a few false positives here, but you want to make sure you don't eat the one that's going to. You're not going to mess with the one that's going to kill you. So I would say probably with respect to survival, you have a desire to avoid false negatives, that it probably transcends social cultures. And then those get encoded into religious rituals or cultural rituals and traditions. Heinrich has a whole, how we became human. Isn't that Heinrich? He has wonderful examples of how, the preparation of cassava in a lot of the tropics is a very specific sequence of steps. That is the only way you make sure that the cassava gets leached, the poison the toxin in the cassava gets leached and makes it fit for human consumption. Cassava is a very high protein nourishment for a lot of the world, but it has to be prepared in a certain sequence, otherwise it'll poison the person who eats it. And so that is one that would probably get encoded as a commandment, as almost a quasi-religious commandment in that culture. This is the way you get it done. So there might be a bunch of dietary restrictions in different cultures that can be traced precisely to that. Well, this is, you've got to train children. You do not eat these in any form, shape, or any, except you do it this way, otherwise it's going to kill you. Or you do not eat this food together with this other food because it's going to kill you, because wood is porous and you don't do that because you'll get killed. So that's what I would say. I'm more likely, and I kind of feel that way sometimes. Oftentimes people say, well, what do you want to do? I don't know. I really don't know what I want to do, but I can pretty much tell you what I don't want to do. Somehow that seems a lot easier for me to answer oftentimes what I don't want to do than what I do want to do. I've got more options there, but what I don't want to do seems to be almost a survival mechanism of some sort, psychological or physical, whatever. So that's a kind of silly answer, but I think that
it's an excellent answer. Okay, so I don't see any more hands up. Those were all the questions in the chat. So,
okay,
Alicia,
thank you so much. Thank you so.
Thank you.
No, thank you,
everybody.
Jabe. Thank you so much.
I'll get to
Keep in
Jabe.
touch,
But
Jabe.
all of you get the book. It's not a very long book, but it's action packed. And
thank you.
And you'll have much more to read when you're done, but we all should.
Thank you so much.
Alicia, please don't wait till come back till your next book.
No,
You're welcome anytime.
I would love that.
Stop by.
I would love that.
Dr. Bloom, thank you for helping me out, because I couldn't have done that if you paid me money. And thanks to all of you for sticking in there with us.
For sticking in there for so long. Thank you.
This has been an awesome experience, and stay tuned. We'll be back with more in the rest of the year. So bye, everybody. Happy 2026.
Happy New Year. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for asking me. Bye-bye.